Now, at this point, it makes sense to learn a bit more about TypeScript and writing good TypeScript code, because we had some places here and there where we had to deal with TypeScript. Like here, where we assign this string type. Or like here, where we had to add this exclamation mark to get rid of some errors, and so on. Now, as I mentioned before, the main advantage TypeScript brings to the table is that it enforces strong and static typing, which in the end means you have to be clear about which type of value goes where. And it's because of that we, for example, get an error if I were to remove this exclamation mark here in this getter. Because without that exclamation mark, TypeScript correctly shows us the possibility that find might not find a user. If this condition here is never met, if we for some reason have a selected user ID that's not part of this user's array, find would return undefined as a value. And that, on the other hand, would cause a problem because we're then trying to access the name property on such a possibly undefined value. And that would simply crash our application. We would run into a runtime error here. That's why TypeScript is complaining about things like this, and that's also why in the user component we had to add those exclamation marks here to rule out this possibility of possibly having an undefined value here. Now, of course, when you add such an exclamation mark, you're not technically ruling out the possibility of getting an undefined value. You're just convincing TypeScript that you, the developer, know that you'll never have an undefined value in that place. And for these properties here, that's, for example, correct because we also set required to true, which means we would get an error during development already if we did forget to set one of those inputs. So we can therefore, with confidence, add this exclamation mark here. In the app component, though, here when using find, it's not necessarily the case that we can say with certainty that this will never be undefined. We maybe can, because after all, it's us writing the code, and we know that we'll always set the selected user ID to an ID that's part of all those users. But if we were to ever change the code, and we, for example, were to set users to a subset of users, for whatever reason, because we added filtering or anything like that, then we could be in a situation where we indeed maybe don't find a user with a selected ID. And therefore, you should be careful with adding marks like this. Instead, in situations where you maybe can't be 100% sure that you'll have a defined value, it's often better to set up some fallback code. For example, one way of dealing with this uncertainty here would be to go to this tasks component where we expect to get a name and to not make it required here, because if we would select a user that doesn't exist, we wouldn't get a name. So we should probably remove this and therefore also remove this exclamation mark. Now with that, we of course get a complaint here, but now we can instead add a question mark. And that question mark now tells TypeScript, hey, it's fine, this might not be set and I'm aware of that. Because the complaint we get without that question mark is just that TypeScript doesn't know whether this value is initialized or not. By adding this question mark, we tell TypeScript, yeah, it might not be initialized and that's okay. And TypeScript does accept this. Now we of course just have to make sure that we never use this name property in a place where it must be set. But for example here, where we just output it like this, it would be fine to do this with an undefined value. That would not cause a problem here. However, we would now have a problem in the app component, Because there, when we use the tasks component, we of course still try to access this name property on selected user, which might be undefined as I mentioned. You can see this here. This strange syntax here means that selected user is either an object that has this shape or it's undefined. And accessing the name property on undefined would give us a runtime error. And we can work around that by adding the question mark here as well, which is JavaScript syntax for saying if selected user is defined, access the name. If it's not, simply use undefined as a fallback value. So with that, we only access the name property if we have an object here. An alternative would be to write a ternary expression where we check if selected user is truthy. And if it is, we output selected user.name. Otherwise, we have some fallback value of our choice, like for example, an empty string, like this. But it is important to be aware of the fact that when working with TypeScript, you have to be clear about which type of value goes where. And that is to your advantage because it can prevent unexpected runtime errors and problems. Now, there is an alternative syntax, an alternative to using this question mark here, which you should also know when working with TypeScript. Because instead of adding that question mark here, you could also change this type here on the right side of that colon, such that you make it clear that the accepted value types for name are either of type string or of type undefined. So this pipe symbol here is an important operator, an important symbol when working with TypeScript, because it creates a so-called union type. It tells TypeScript that the type of value that can be stored in something, in this property here, in this case, is either of type string or of type undefined. And the only value that is of type undefined is the value undefined. And that then would also work, because with that code you would make it clear that it's fine if name is not defined initially. It may hold a string, but it can also be undefined. So that's an alternative to using that question mark. But of course, the question mark is a bit shorter, so I'll use that. Nonetheless, you should know about this optional types feature, about this union type feature, because from time to time you do need to accept multiple possible values, and now you do how you could do that.